Hey everybody, it's Chuck Johnson here. It is Friday, 4 o'clock, April 22nd. It's my half birthday, interestingly enough. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, a lot of people are asking me, writing into me, calling me, asking me, Chuck, what do you think about Harriet Tubman being on the 20? What does it mean? What does it mean for our republic? What does it mean for our society generally? Well, I must say that I have a sort of odd view of money. My sense is that money, like a lot of things, are things that humans come to believe in because we're a mimetic species. We copy each other, and we want to believe certain things in order to keep pace. That's why people like me, people who are truth tellers, people who are different, have been persecuted throughout human history. People who look different have been persecuted because they're different than the norm. And this is not a particularly original thesis of mine, but my sense is that the more the currency reflects the people who live there, the majority of those people, rather than some distinct minority, the better the society will ultimately be. And I have a sort of progressive theory of how currency changes represent collapses of society generally. Now, with that in mind, I thought I would take a gander at the world's currencies. And fortunately, Vox, that Ezra Klein publication, has gone through and done the yeoman's work of going country by country and looking at where all the women are in the world who are on the bills. And what's interesting here is that so many of the currencies that are not Anglosphere or royalty systems that have women on their currencies and sort of ethno-states, so many of them are sort of progressive or third world hellholes, or Nordic countries. And the Nordics by and large are sort of equality obsessed. They are, they have all these quotas for women in their parliament. They're essentially, it's like the gender studies department took over a series of countries. That's sort of how they operate. Now, what are some of the countries that are not royalty that have women on their currency, which is sort of what Harriet Tubman would be, right? Tubman would be in the keeping. And what are those currencies? What do they have that are not? How would I put this? What are the things that these countries have in common? So if a country has a royal figure on it, I sort of discount it because it's part of a royalty, it's part of a traditional system. I mean, even if you have a suffragette on your currency, as does Australia and New Zealand, but you ultimately have Queen Elizabeth on your currency, it's sort of like the royalty thing kind of outweighs the stupid idea of letting women vote idea. So anyway, so I looked around, and so one of the things you discover rather quickly is Argentina is one of those countries. Eva Perón, don't cry for me, Argentina. She's on the $100 peso. Argentina, of course, is a great economic country that we should, of course, emulate. Not. You, of course, got Cape Verde, that economic powerhouse. Cesaria Evora, who was a singer there. You'll find also, by the way, that a lot of the times they have women on their currencies. It's a singer. It's an opera singer or a singer. In Chile, you have Gabriela Mistral. I don't really know who she is, so let me Google her. She's a poet. Okay. She's a poet, diplomat, educator, and humanist. Okay, so she's some lefty. And she was there in the old regime back when Chile was one of the richest countries in the world. And by the way, this will matter. This matters because whenever a country starts to put women on its currency, that country, if it's not a member of the British Empire, that country starts to have trouble later on, as we shall see. We'll also be talking about sort of the racial element as well, because there are countries that remove their white majority people off of their bills ultimately have problems. Now, Colombia has a seamstress and a spy. By the way, this is my dog Aria. What? No, Arya, no. Don't flash everyone. This is my dog, Arya. She is 7, because of dog years. And she's looking forward to meeting her namesake on Game of Thrones Day. Anyways, Arya, go play. Go play. Go play. So anyway, so where was I? Oh, yes. We were going through the list of countries. We've got, and by the way, if a country has a princess or some royal figure, I sort of discount them as well. So we've got Chile, we've got Costa Rica, Carmen Lira is on the bill. Colombia has a seamstress and a spy on its bill. On its bills, it's 10,000 pesos currency. You've got Dominican Republic. You have political activists. Another, or poet as well. You've got Haiti. I guess you have Iceland. I guess I could give Iceland. Iceland's sort of a Nordic country, so it's a little weird. It has a seamstress. Seamstress is on its currency. God only knows if I can pronounce that name. You've got Nanny of the Maroons for Jamaica. Japan, you have a writer. Where am I going with this? Kyrgyzstan, you have a stateswoman. Malawi, you have a leader of the African Congress, so communist. Mexico, you have two. You have a nun, scholar, poet, and you have a member of the Communist Party, a Communist Party militant. Nigeria, you have a potter, because that's big, I guess. And Peru, you have a Catholic saint. Philippines, you have female president. So what do most of these countries have in common? Most of them are total economic basket cases, or ethno-states that are becoming basket cases as they've imported the third world. Now, what does this all mean? We've got Ukraine, which has a poet-writer. We've got Venezuela that has another woman heroine. In Britain, you have Elizabeth Fry, prison reformer, aka communist. Now, why does this matter? Well, the more progressive a country becomes, the more the country's currency is in trouble. And you can see this in the case of either Zimbabwe, / Rhodesia, which went from a very stable currency system to hyperinflation. The Robert Mugabe's son, or his grandson rather, just became a citizen of Singapore because he was born there. So the future generations almost never ultimately stay in the country, despite the bad wishes or bad practices of the society of which they're a part. And of course, you see this in South Africa as well, which went from who was somebody who was supposedly the old Dutch colonial administrator, a guy named Verstook, to Nelson Mandela, who's on most of the currency today. The language obviously has changed. They've gone from English and Afrikaans to English and all of these African languages on the currency. So that gives you some sense. And by the way, the South African currency was one of the strongest in the world for quite a long time, and now it's quite weak under the ANC management. Now, currency is a form of iconography. It's a form of, it's a form of showing something has worth. That's why the progressive left is so interested in changing it, because they want to say, oh, these new things have worth. Just like when they tear down our statues of Confederate war heroes, or of trying to replace the colleges. They're supposedly too many white men throughout human history, and so we have to go and remove them. Now, if you're a young person who's a white man, this is kind of a little frightening, to put it mildly. The question you always have is like, well, what's really going on here? What's really happening? And what's happening is that people are replacing whites. That's what's going on, either in immigration policy or birth rates, or in terms of what should be venerated and what should be celebrated. And it's happening slowly, it's happening gradually, but it's happening nonetheless. And so every time you buy into identity politics, you ultimately participate in this system. Now, there are lots of people who are like, oh, but Chuck, we kept Hamilton on the 10. Isn't this great? Hamilton's great and all the rest of it. Sure, Hamilton's a very impressive guy, but let's not kid ourselves. Hamilton was a supporter of central banking. Hamilton was the founder of the Constitution, or at least the founder of the Federalist Papers, which ultimately was what made the political case for ratifying the Constitution. And he was a sort of like aide de camp. He was never elected in his own right, like Jackson was. He was never a war hero in any meaningful sense, like Jackson was. He never built a machine politics that helped Scots-Irish become a part of the system, which is ultimately what Old Hickory did. And Hamilton, of course, has been appropriated. He has become made cool in a weird way, which is what this Broadway thing is all about. Now, if you read the original, if you read the Chernow book about Hamilton, it wrestles with Hamilton seriously. It takes him seriously, but what's been done is Hamilton has been turned into a musical. Hamilton has been turned into this joke, and it's essentially about removing whites. It's about making whites no longer interesting, no longer exciting. And you've got people like, you've got all these folks who are involved in trying to make Hamilton appropriate Hamilton. Hamilton now becomes the cool founder. He becomes exciting. Of course, it's all a musical. It's all kind of a joke, rather than actually performing a play about the serious issues that Hamilton wrestled with. What kind of constitution are we in? It's all about venerating blacks, appropriating something culturally, and that's sort of what we're doing now. We are removing the pesky white people from the population, and we're removing their icons. We're tearing down statues. We are going after the Rhodes Scholars are attacking the Cecil Rhodes, the guy who gave the money to make their scholarship. And this is where we are. This is where the conversation is right now. And everything has to be sort of filtered through this racial lens, rather than celebrating the important ideas that are a part of it, a part of our society. Now, a lot of conservatives don't really understand this. They don't really appreciate this. They don't understand that, in some measure, the Hamilton thing is kind of a joke. It's a way of mocking Western civilization. It's a way of mocking somebody like Hamilton. It's all about having a fun, having a laugh, having a sense of excitement, having a sense of play when it comes to the American experience. And that's if they're not just going to write, that's if they're just not going to write people out altogether. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these are figures that are evil white men, even though we know from Tom West's book called Vindicating the Founders, and we know from the sort of Claremont Project that a lot of these guys were advanced on the racial issues of their day. Although they did believe in a sort of racial hierarchy, which is, of course, which they had seen and observed through nature. And that gives you some sense, of where we're kind of going. Now, one of the presidents that I found most interesting, the only one to sort of be featured on a coin in his lifetime, to the best of my knowledge, was Calvin Coolidge. And I wrote a book, Why Coolidge Matters, Leadership Lessons from America's Most Underrated President. And what I found interesting about Coolidge was the way in which he reached out to all these different ethnic groups to make them a part of the Republican coalition. And while it's true that Jackson did the Trail of Tears, that he marched the Cherokee, all these places, this was war. I mean, these were the times in which we lived, or which our people lived. And we shouldn't forget that peopling the American continent was a very violent process, a violent but necessary process, ultimately, for civilization to thrive, and for the West to continue, and for America to be that receptacle of Western values. Now, Coolidge, of course, helped the Indians assimilate. He ultimately helped them become a larger part of the society. He signed the bill that made them all citizens. But his view is that they all became citizens in large measure because of the sacrifices of World War I. So there was no sense in which one could become a citizen. One could have certain rights without also having certain duties. And those who partook of the duties ultimately also partook of the rights. And so that was sort of the thinking. But we don't really have a notion of rights. We have a notion of give me that, give me this. We don't have a notion of rights or duties. in any meaningful sense. People try and get out of jury duty. People try and get out of civic obligations. People don't serve in the military. We have no draft. To the extent people serve in the military, it's largely out of familial pride or because of where they're from in the country, and in some sense a sincere patriotism. Although there is a certain sense in which generations of people are becoming soldiers as a profession, which was obviously something that the founders abhorred. Now, why do I find this interesting? Well, what we're trying to do here at this podcast is in some measure study and probe and think through the ultimate decline of the United States and of the world at large, and what are the opportunities we can have to make money off of it? What are the opportunities we can have to understand what's really going on? And what you need to understand is that as our currency and our culture becomes more black, what ends up happening is our society becomes ultimately more dysfunctional. So whether it's in the form of insisting that the Oscars be more diversified, whether it's in the form of insisting that our colleges admit anyone who has who has a low IQ but happens to have the right color pigmentation, whether it's in the form of diversifying our courts, our regulatory bodies, it's all about a project and a process of ultimately disinheriting a group of people who built a civilization. And it's unfortunate, and it needs to be fought against to the extent that one can. Although ultimately, I suspect it won't really work out all that well. And so we'll have to go and create a new society, whether it be existing on the internet or it'll be existing in some more meaningful sense. But in any event, I'm working very hard on the next projects, and we'll be in touch in the days to weeks to come. Thanks again for tuning in.